One push, one fleeting moment of anger, and a quiet riverside town would never be the same again. She vanished without a trace, leaving only whispers, questions, and a secret her husband hoped would stay buried forever. Today on Last Clue, we uncover the tragic story of a missing wife and the truth that couldn't stay hidden. It was the summer of 2018 in Willow Creek, a quiet riverside town in upstate New York, where life moved slowly and neighbors knew each other by name. Streets lined with maple trees and picket fences gave the impression of safety, and the river that ran through the town was a favorite spot for morning walks and lazy afternoons. But behind the walls of one modest home, tension simmered, hidden from the friendly eyes of the community. Evelyn Harper, 72, was known for her warmth and gentle nature. She tended her garden with care, smiled at everyone she passed, and had a routine that was as predictable as sunrise. Her husband, Harold Harper, 75, a retired factory worker, was quiet, meticulous, and sometimes prone to short temper. They had lived in Willow Creek for decades, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of the town. Yet even in long marriages, cracks can form. Neighbors often heard raised voices or caught glimpses of disagreement, but nothing alarming, until that fateful evening changed everything. On July 12, 2018, what began as a minor argument would escalate in ways no one could have imagined. One moment of lost control would set off a chain of events that shook Willow Creek to its core, leaving a woman missing, a community in shock, and a husband carrying a secret that would not stay hidden. In the days leading up to her disappearance, subtle signs of tension had begun to appear in the Harper household. Harold, normally methodical and predictable, had started missing appointments and seemed unusually irritable. Neighbors noticed him pacing the porch in the evenings, muttering under his breath, while Evelyn appeared more anxious than usual, pausing during her walks as if sensing an unspoken tension in the air. To outsiders, nothing seemed overtly alarming, but those closest to the couple could feel the unease growing, like ripples spreading across the calm surface of the Willow River. On the afternoon of July 12, 2018, Evelyn was seen strolling toward the riverbank, humming softly, as she often did. Harold followed behind her, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured sharply in conversation. Witnesses later recalled seeing voices raised, gestures growing more animated. The argument, though brief, was intense. A neighbor across the street remembered thinking, "That wasn't like them, something feels off." By sunset, Evelyn had disappeared. Hours passed with no sign of her, no answering phone calls, no neighborly check-ins. Harold told neighbors she had gone for her usual evening walk, a lie born out of panic. The community's initial concerns soon escalated into worry as friends and relatives reported her missing. Posters were printed. Social media alerts circulated. Volunteers formed search parties, scouring the banks of the Willow River, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. Investigators arrived within 48 hours. Detective Laura Simmons would later recall the initial scene. The riverbank looked undisturbed at first glance, but subtle clues told a different story. Footprints in the mud, scuffed rocks, a handkerchief lying near the water's edge. Something had happened here, and it wasn't just a missing person. Meanwhile, Harold's behavior became increasingly erratic. Friends described him as withdrawn, avoiding questions about Evelyn's whereabouts, offering vague accounts of her last known movements. Even small inconsistencies, a misplaced chair, an overlooked object, began to form a pattern. The tension in Willow Creek thickened with each passing day, and the town began to whisper. Had Evelyn run away? Was there foul play? Or was something darker hiding behind Harold's quiet demeanor? Every clue, every detail seemed minor at first, but for detectives trained to read between the lines, they added up. The pieces were quietly falling into place, setting the stage for a revelation that would shock the town. One fleeting moment of anger, one misstep, and a seemingly ordinary day would turn into a mystery that no one could ignore. The tragedy unfolded in a matter of seconds, yet its consequences would echo for years. On that summer evening, Harold Harper and his wife Evelyn were taking their usual evening stroll along the Willow River, the water glinting gold in the fading sunlight. Their conversation had started lightheartedly, but soon words were exchanged, voices rising as the tension that had been building for days came to a head. In a moment Harold would later call a freak accident, his hand shot out in anger, shoving Evelyn. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on the uneven riverbank. Rocks scraped against her legs as she fell, her body tumbling toward the cold, swift current. The sound of splashing water was almost muted by Harold's gasp, as if the river itself swallowed the moment. Evelyn tried desperately to regain her balance, but the current was relentless. Within seconds, she was swept away, disappearing from view. Harold froze, panic rooting him to the spot. Fear, shame, and disbelief collided in his mind. He knew what had happened, and yet he could not bring himself to call for help. His thoughts raced. If I report it, it's over. They'll take everything. They'll lock me up. In his terror, he convinced himself that silence was safer. By nightfall, Evelyn was officially missing, and Harold's secret remained hidden, locked behind trembling hands and whispered lies. Meanwhile, Willow Creek awoke to a growing unease. Neighbors noticed Evelyn had not returned. Phones rang unanswered, and her usual evening routine never occurred. Search parties were quickly organized. Boats combed the river, flashlights swept across the banks, and worried voices called her name into the night. Yet there was no sign of her, only the gentle ripple of the water, carrying fragments of a life now suspended in mystery. The town, initially calm, began to whisper. Had she run away? But one neighbor, Mrs. Dean, a retired teacher with a keen eye, remembered something peculiar. They were arguing, not loudly, but enough to notice. Harold's gestures were sharp, abrupt, almost frantic, and Evelyn kept stepping back as if trying to create space. At first, these observations seemed minor, a possible interpretation of a mundane disagreement. Yet detectives knew that ordinary lives often hide extraordinary events, and small details frequently become critical in uncovering the truth. Simmons and Patel turned to family and close friends. Interviews revealed subtle inconsistencies in Harold's story. He had reported that Evelyn went for her usual evening stroll, but the timeline conflicted with the testimonies of neighbors. Calls to her cell phone went unanswered. Her cat, usually calm and quiet, had been meowing for hours, a sign that something was amiss at home. Her garden remained untended that evening, an unusual break from routine. Detectives noted these anomalies and began piecing together a timeline. They revisited the riverbank, measuring footprints, sketching positions, and cataloging evidence. Each clue tightened the net. Soil disturbance suggested a sudden backward movement. Rock scrapes indicated someone had fallen violently. The handkerchief, when sent for analysis, revealed faint traces of Evelyn's blood, just enough to suggest injury, but not conclusive proof of intent. Despite the mounting evidence, Harold's demeanor during questioning remained puzzling. At first, he was calm, collected, and cooperative, offering basic information about his and Evelyn's evening stroll. But as detectives pressed further, subtle cracks appeared. His eyes would dart to the floor, hands would tremble, and his tone shifted when asked about specific times or movements. Simmons noted the difference between grief and guilt. Harold wasn't grieving in the way you expect, she said. He was terrified. There's a weight that guilt places on someone. He carried that weight like a shadow. Adding complexity to the investigation, early theories emerged. Some neighbors speculated that Evelyn might have run away, perhaps upset over the argument. Others wondered if an unknown intruder had attacked her along the river. Rumors spread. Sightings of strangers near the bank, claims of mysterious footprints leading into the woods, even stories of late-night lights on the river. Each theory was investigated, but forensic evidence consistently pointed back to the couple. The detectives allowed these possibilities to remain on the table, understanding that uncertainty creates tension, but they were careful not to mislead the family or the community. The tension in Harold grew palpable. Every conversation, every footstep outside the house, every knock on the door seemed to heighten his anxiety. He began avoiding the investigators, claiming fatigue or memory lapses. Yet small slips, hesitations, contradicting his earlier statements, vague pauses, kept him under scrutiny. Simmons and Patel noticed patterns. When asked about the handkerchief, his voice would tighten. When asked about his last interactions with Evelyn, he would avert his gaze. The breakthrough came when detectives presented the physical evidence in a manner that left no room for doubt. "We know you were with her by the river," Patel said gently, showing him photographs of the footprints, scuff marks, and the handkerchief. "We know the timeline. We just need the truth, Harold." Trembling, Harold's facade began to crumble. Hours of questioning led to a slow confession. He recounted the stroll, the argument, and the shove. He described Evelyn stumbling backward, her foot catching on the uneven riverbank, the splash of water, the terrifying seconds as she disappeared into the current. Every word was laced with remorse and disbelief, a portrait of a man trapped by fear and guilt. He admitted he had not called for help, not out of malice, but out of panic. "I didn't mean it," he whispered. "It was an accident. I couldn't tell anyone." Even after his confession, the town wrestled with shock and disbelief. How could a momentary lapse lead to such devastation? Why had Harold not sought help? Investigators explored psychological explanations, panic responses, fear of legal consequences, and the cognitive paralysis that often follows traumatic incidents. Experts noted that Harold's reaction was consistent with a fight-or-flight freeze, where fear prevents rational action. Yet the case was not without lingering questions. Could Harold's temper have been escalating unnoticed for years? Could neighbors have intervened? Was there a way to prevent such tragedies, even in seemingly quiet towns? The investigation revealed the delicate interplay between human emotion, chance, and consequence. How ordinary lives can pivot in a single heartbeat. By the time Harold's full account was recorded, the detectives had pieced together a complete timeline. Each step, from the stroll to the shove, to the river's swift current, to his fearful silence, was documented, analyzed, and corroborated by physical evidence. For Willow Creek, the truth was devastating, but it brought clarity. The mystery of Evelyn Harper's disappearance was solved, yet it left the town with haunting reflections on trust, fear, and the fragility of human life. Even after Harold Harper's confession, questions lingered in Willow Creek. How could a simple stroll along the river, a routine so ordinary, end in such tragedy? How could one man's moment of anger unravel a lifetime of stability? Investigators, psychologists, and townspeople all struggled to reconcile the facts with the quiet normalcy of the Harper household. Psychologists who later reviewed the case suggested that Harold's actions were consistent with what they called a panic freeze response, a momentary lapse in judgment under extreme stress. The shove itself was unintentional, yet fear instantly overtook rational thought. He didn't plan to harm her, one expert noted, but the combination of anger, panic, and fear of consequences created a perfect storm. His decision not to call for help, though horrifying, reflected a common psychological response to accidental injury, denial compounded by terror. Yet the town refused to accept the explanation without lingering doubt. Some neighbors questioned whether Harold's temper had been escalating over the years. Had anyone noticed subtle signs, silent arguments, withdrawn behaviors that foreshadowed this tragedy? Friends who knew the couple described them as loving yet occasionally tense, and some admitted that they had brushed off earlier arguments as normal for an older couple. Willow Creek began to ask itself, was this a freak accident, or had tension been simmering, waiting for the right moment to erupt? Alternative theories also floated in whispers around town. A few residents speculated that Evelyn might have been pushed deliberately out of anger, an intentional act, not an accident. Others suggested the presence of an intruder or even foul play connected to distant family disputes. Investigators examined each possibility, confirming that the footprints, evidence, and Harold's eventual confession aligned. Still, the psychological weight of what could have been haunted the community. Harold's motives were rooted in fear as much as anger. When asked why he had not immediately reported the incident, he admitted to investigators that panic had clouded his judgment. "I was scared of losing everything," he confessed. That fear, of jail, of judgment, of community scorn, kept him silent, transforming a tragic accident into a prolonged mystery. The courtroom was tense as the evidence was laid out. Photographs of the riverbank, footprints in the mud, the handkerchief with Evelyn's fingerprints, and the timeline of Harold's confession. The jury heard how a brief shove, one moment of lost control, had turned a peaceful stroll into a fatal accident. Experts explained the devastating consequences of Harold's decision not to call for help, emphasizing how fear can transform an accident into a prolonged tragedy. In the end, the judge handed down a sentence that reflected both the severity of the outcome and the lack of malicious intent. Harold received a term consistent with involuntary manslaughter, alongside probation and mandated counseling. While the law had delivered a verdict, it could not erase the sorrow, the mistrust, or the haunting questions that remained in Willow Creek. Evelyn's body was eventually recovered downstream, giving her family the painful closure they had long awaited. Funeral services brought the community together in mourning, yet beneath the grief lingered a quiet unease. The river, once a place of calm walks and summer reflection, now carried the memory of a tragic misstep. Neighbors whispered about what they had seen, friends reflected on what they hadn't noticed, and Harold himself faced the daily weight of remorse, a reminder that a single moment can alter countless lives. For Willow Creek, life eventually returned to its rhythm, but the shadows of that evening never fully lifted. The story became a somber lesson in the fragility of human life, the danger of fear, and the consequences of silence. The town had witnessed firsthand how ordinary routines, a stroll along a river, a passing argument, could spiral into irreversible tragedy. In the quiet aftermath, the community and investigators alike were left to grapple with lingering questions. Could anyone have intervened? Could the accident have been prevented? And most haunting of all, what does it say about the fragility of human emotion when fear and guilt take over? For Willow Creek, the answers were as elusive as the currents of the river itself. The river returned to its quiet rhythm, the gentle lapping of water against the bank masking the tragedy it had witnessed. Willow Creek, once defined by calm streets and familiar routines, had been forever altered by a single, fleeting moment, a shove, a stumble, and the relentless pull of the current. Life resumed, but the echoes of that evening lingered, invisible yet impossible to ignore. Harold Harper remained a man marked by his own actions, living with a guilt that no sentence could erase. Every walk along the river, every glance at the water, reminded him of what had been lost and what he had allowed to slip away. For the community, the incident was a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most ordinary lives are fragile, and that fear, shame, or silence can transform an accident into an enduring mystery. For investigators and those who followed the case, Evelyn Harper's story became more than a missing person report. It was a study of human nature, a glimpse into the consequences of unchecked emotion, and a lesson in how quickly routine can unravel into tragedy. It was a story that raised questions without easy answers. Could anyone have prevented it? Was it truly an accident? Or was there more hidden beneath the surface? And yet, for all the answers uncovered, some mysteries remained, small, haunting fragments that lingered in the shadows of Willow Creek. For last clue, Evelyn Harper's story is a somber reminder that behind every disappearance lies a truth waiting to be uncovered, and a single moment can change everything forever.